There were a lot of questions about Linda Zagzebski's view, and here are a couple sort of introductory points that I think we should go through to get in before we get into other particular questions. So some of you sort of asked something like, is Zagzebski really saying that we should focus on intellectual virtues and not on whether a belief is justified? That's what the question we should be asking in epistemology. And the answer to that is simply yes, she thinks. Epistemology that focuses on this very narrow question of whether a belief is justified is not the right way to think of epistemology. Instead, we should focus on whether particular people have certain intellectual virtues. So a follow-up on that is like, so is she trying to give a theory that's totally different from internalism and externalism? And the answer, I think, again, is yes. She's not trying to give a theory of justification. She's trying to give a different kind of theory. Now, they're all trying to give a theory that tells us like some important things about epistemology, but hers is totally different. Hers is not a competing answer to the question, what makes a belief justified? She's not answering that question. She's answering a different question, or she's concerned with different issues. And then some of you followed up by saying, look, how do we develop and identify virtues without talking about justification? So it still seems like justification is basic. In other words, isn't an intellectually virtuous person just a person with lots of justified beliefs? If that's right, it might look like justification is still playing the fundamental important role. And I think what she'll say here is she'll say, look, intellectually virtuous people might in fact have a lot of beliefs that other theorists would call justified, but I'm not concerned with justification. And in particular, she doesn't want to identify an intellectually justified or virtuous person as someone with lots of justified beliefs. She doesn't want to define them that way or analyze virtues that way. Instead, she thinks we have a pre-theoretic understanding of virtues. We know virtues. We can understand virtues like insight better than we can understand concepts like justification, which she thinks are artificial. So here maybe is an example, and this actually is she's thinking very much the way Aristotle thinks of ethical virtues of action. So here's maybe how we can think of an example. So I talked a little bit about insight last time, and let me bring that back up and talk at a little bit more length. So what is insight? Well, it's not simply having a lot of justified beliefs. That's not what the definition of insight is. Insight is something more. It's a character that a person has that allows them to think in certain ways, that allows them to be a good believer, a good knower in certain ways. In particular, insight might be something like you can see interesting answers to questions. You can foresee things that other people can't when you're in inquiry. You might be able to see which are good ways, which are good routes of asking questions or thinking about an issue, and which are not good routes of thinking about an issue that'll get you closer to the right answer. That sounds like an account of insight that is not based in justified beliefs itself. Now, how do we sort of come to have it? You might say, like, look, how is that telling me anything just to tell me insight is a good characteristic to have? How am I going to know if I'm not insightful, how to become insightful? And Zagzebski hasn't talked about this, but Aristotle gives an answer to something like this question. Aristotle might say, patience is a virtue, or courage is a virtue. How do I become courageous? How do I become patient? Well, the answer is to not to look at, say, individual actions and say, is this the right action? Is this the wrong action? Instead, it's to look at somebody who is patient, to look at somebody who is courageous, to look at moral exemplars who exemplify, who have these traits, who have these virtues, and try to be like them. Try to form the habits that they form that will let you cultivate those virtues. I think if you're a virtue epistemologist like Zagzebski, you want to say something very similar. Who's a good thinker? Who's a good believer? Who's a good knower? Who's a good inquirer? Who does these things well? Look at what they do. Look at somebody who's insightful and try to form the habits that they form. Maybe they practice math problems for 20 minutes every night. That helps them with their insight. Maybe they do puzzles. Maybe they try new types of games. They get themselves into different experiences so they can try things out. You should try to cultivate the habits that they cultivate so you can come to have the intellectual virtues that they have. All of this, she'll think, and Aristotle would think about ethics, is much more substantive than asking, is this action right or wrong? Should I do it or not? That's the fundamental question. Or in epistemology, is this belief justified or unjustified? Should I have it or not? This is a much richer, more substantive picture about getting yourself into the habits of thought and action that make you the kind of person that you should be, that develop in you the virtues that you should have.